now for a bit of stock taking on Nigeria's march, economically speaking, in the past 59 years. We are now being joined by Johnson Chukwu, an investment banker and managing director of Cowrie Asset Management Limited, as well as Muda Yusuf, Director General of Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
I see you guys are specially dressed for Independence Day. I mean, I'm used to seeing you in suits. But today
we have to celebrate.
You have to celebrate Nigeria.
Yes, we have to
it's
celebrate.
Very good. But
yes.
see, I would like us to start with the President's Independence Day broadcast this morning. I don't know whether you listened to him. He specifically paid attention to the need to accelerate economic growth. I mean, he gave his administration some credit. He says we have, a very strong external reserve. He's been able to grow that. The foreign exchange, he says, is quite stable. Nigeria has been able to move out of recession under his watch, and we've had, since our exit from recession, 9 quarters of consecutive growth. That's in terms of the achievement that he outlined. And then he went on to talk about other things that will be done in terms of diversification, in terms of increasing the non-oil job-creating sector of the economy and all of that. But let me start with you, Johnson Chukwu. What do you think of all of these achievements and the plans that the president seems to be proposing?
Well, on the achievement, I would say that what he said are factual. I mean, we have had 9 consecutive months of economic growth since we came out of recession. The issues remain that the growth rate is not sufficient to take people out of poverty. There's no doubt the economy is growing, but it's growing at a very slow rate. And that growth rate is not even commensurate with the population growth rate. We saw in the last year, 2018, the economy grew by only 1.92%. The population is growing about 2.6, 2.7%. Even at the second quarter of this year, the economy grew by only 1.94%. In fact, a decline from the 2.10% we had in the first quarter of the year. So it is not that the economy is not growing. It's just that the challenge is that the economy is growing at a rate that is actually pushing more and more people into poverty. And I'm happy that the president has recognized the importance of focusing on the economy. He has set up an economic advisory council. He has also ensured that economic advisory council is reporting straight to him, which means he has taken on responsibility for the failure or success of the Nigerian economy as it stands for the next 4 years. So I think what matters to me is that, one, we have realized that the economy is the most important thing we should focus on. If you do everything right and you get the economy wrong, everything collapses. And right now, the emphasis of the government is on the economy. So I'm also happy that the president's speech dwelled mostly on economic issues, though he made references to issues of improvement in security situation, focusing on the Niger Delta and realigning the reporting line of NDDC to the Ministry of Niger Delta and such like that. But most of his speech was more on the economy. And if you cast your mind to Obasanjo's second time, that's also what happened. Obasanjo became more serious about the economy his second time when he realized that his history as a president was going to be defined by how well the economy did.
Well, I think that's really interesting. I wonder if it's fair to say that the president was very gentle and not as hard as he could have been when critiquing the economy, because while we can acknowledge that the rate of growth has slowed over time, I think it's very interesting that he didn't mention how much or how the growth has been slowing down. If we look at the causes for that slowdown, ultimately we have to stop at debt and the fact that Nigeria is drowning in a lot of debt. Mr. Muda Yusuf, you've talked about this level of debt. It's actually at $81 billion, around 25 trillion naira. It's not sustainable, is it? How did we get here?
Well, I don't think it's sustainable. But first, let me say that the president has demonstrated a lot of passion. He has demonstrated a great deal of what I would call economic nationalism, about trying to promote self-reliance, eat what we produce, wear what we produce, and so on and so forth. The commitment is good. And I've also seen complementary commitments, from some of the agencies of government, like the central bank and all of that, trying to complement the diversification the diversification efforts of the president. All these things are good, and I think we have made some progress. But what is most critical in all of this is how sustainable are we? How sustainable are these things? Because all these things are about it's not just about the aspiration. It's not just about the wish. It's not just about the economic nationalism. It's about the kind of strategy to drive those things. So on the score of the commitment and passion, I think the president has demonstrated significant commitment. But on the score of the strategy to fix it, I think that is where we have some issues. And I think that perhaps informed this idea of bringing on board a team of economists, to look at issues of strategy to achieve the desired outcomes. From independence to now, we have seen a lot of transformation. We started from being basically an agrarian economy, where the agricultural sector was actually providing not just the jobs, but also the revenue, the export earnings and all of that. That is where we are coming from. And that economy, by its very nature, was a very inclusive economy. Because before you can make money or get some export revenue from agriculture, the people will have made money, because the people are the one driving the process. It's a kind of bottom-up kind of economy. So it was a very participatory economy. It was a very inclusive economy. But we lost it the moment we ran into oil money, and the focus now shifted from what was an inclusive economy to an oil economy, to a sharing economy, and all of that. So these are very fundamental issues of structure, which we have not been able to address, because we missed it the moment in the 70s and so on when we came into oil, and the whole structure of the economy was upside down. And that is where the problem started from.
Well, the president talked about his government's determination to deal with, to take decisive action, in the face of predatory trade practices, protect the oil and gas sector, and also check illegal smuggling. And, in recent times, we've had some efforts in that direction. The closure of the border between Nigeria and the Republic of Benin, for example, and then the attempt by the Nigeria Customs Service, to go to car marts or go to shops looking for smuggled materials, and, of course, creating hardship, by the way, for traders. What kind of strategy do you think the government should adopt instead of what we have seen? Or you think the president is sending a signal that more borders will be shut down, or the customs service will go after people in their shops instead of doing their job at the inspection point at the borders?
You see, what I feel about that whole approach is like fighting the symptom without dealing with the causes. Because when you see the scale of smuggling that has been taking place, it's a demonstration of the fact that there are some fundamental shortcomings, both within the economy and shortcomings with our institutions. So we have issues of productivity, for instance, within the economy. Because if you have an economy where your productivity is weak and your population is growing, demand is growing, and supply is not able to match up with the demand, you are likely to see a scenario where domestic prices will be going up. And
that is what's happening. Domestic prices are going up.
They are going up. And if you have a scenario where you have a neighbor where prices are almost maybe 50% of what your own prices are, there's a natural tendency, there's a natural pressure for goods to move from that part of the economy, whether it is international, to your own economy. So there's a major issue with productivity within the economy. And the president also alluded to that in his speech when he was talking about the structural problems that he inherited. That you have an economy where maybe 5% of the oil sector is contributing 5% to GDP, but contributing 70% to revenue, 90% to foreign exchange earnings. So this is indicative of the weakness of the non-oil economy. So we need to address fundamentals of productivity. Secondly, we need to address issues of institutional capacity. Because to a large extent, what is happening at the borders is also a failure of institutions. Unfortunately, nobody is talking about that. You just say, okay, go and close it. But now you have closed the border, you say you have achieved some results. That means most of those products are coming through those borders anyway. You know? So that is an indication that we need to deal with issues of institutional capacity. Because one of the major problems we have in this economy is the weakness of state institutions. And if state institutions are not effective, it will be difficult for reforms and policies to function. Then we need to also relate to issues of tariff relativity. If your import tariff, especially for manufactured goods or things like that, in this economy is almost 3 times or 4 times what you have in neighboring countries, that is also a problem. So there are policy solutions to this. There are institutional issues to be dealt with, rather than just closing the border. Those solutions are not sustainable solutions. And it's a good thing that the president in his speech also spoke elaborately about infrastructure, about releases for capital projects and all of that. Perhaps that will get us somewhere. But we still have a big issue of productivity in the non-oil economy. I think that is the key.
Well, Johnson Chukwu, you know, the president kept talking about inclusive growth, macroeconomic stability, economic diversification. These are standard phrases we hear all the time from government, and they are major areas of challenge. What kind of advice will you give the president? Although the president himself makes it clear in the later part of his 53-paragraph speech that the Economic Advisory Council is there to address him, to advise him, and that it shows his commitment, you know, to these economic objectives. So how do you think that Economic Advisory Council can really be effective and serve the purpose that the president referred to in his speech?
Those substructures you need to put in place to diversify the economy in the medium to long term. Of course, diversifying the economy is not a light bulb approach. You can't just switch on the light, switch and then the light come up. It's a gradual process. But we need to build the subframes. And what are those subframes? You look at your infrastructural base. Today, without adequate infrastructure, you're not going to diversify your economy. And when you talk about infrastructure base, you have to talk about infrastructure that's efficient and that relatively affordable. Because if it's expensive, it becomes, you end up being a non-competitive, productive environment. And for me, some of the critical infrastructure we lack today, the government should focus on transport infrastructure. And when you talk of transport infrastructure, you're talking of multimodal transport infrastructure, starting from the road network to the airports, the seaports, and the rail system. We must have them working and working efficiently. And the cost of moving goods and services from one location to another must be relatively affordable. And when I talk about this, I'm looking at what countries that have succeeded in positioning the economy. Countries like China. China today has one of the most efficient infrastructure supply in the world. The Western European countries have one of among the most efficient, productive places other than the cost of labor. Then the other aspect you have to look at, the other substructure you have to look at, is the issue of human capital. And when you talk about human capital, you're talking about the entire government of the human capital supply. You're talking of issues like quality of labor. You're talking of issue of, and to address the issue of quality of labor, you have to address the issue of the educational system and the orientation educational system. The inclusiveness of the educational system must be addressed. Everybody who is of school age must go to school. The curriculum must be attuned to the current economic realities of the world.
Well, Johnson Chukwu, if I may ask you to pause a little, we'll still come back to this issue about, economic diversification and macroeconomic stability. You see on the screen there, more dignitaries are arriving at the presidential villa for Independence Day celebration.
Honorable Minister of the Federal Capital Territory, the Secretary to the Government of the Federation, the Chief of Defense Staff, Service Chiefs and the Inspector General of Police, Your Excellencies, most distinguished invited guests, members of the Diplomatic Corps, ambassadors, high commissioners, defense attaches, senior military officers, both serving and deservedly retired, ladies and gentlemen. Shortly, it will be the arrival of the President of the Senate. Your Excellencies, most distinguished invited guests, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, gentlemen, we just had to take a quick look at what is going on at the Independence Day parade. I think we'll come back to it, and then we'll try to attempt an assessment of whether, you know, Nigeria has every reason or any cause to celebrate, or whether or not today should be devoted to just sober reflection. But Johnson Chukwu, you were trying to lay a foundation for economic diversification and the importance of infrastructure.
Yes. So, like I said, the starting point, you have to build the subframes. When I talk about the subframe, these are the pillars that will sustain long-term economic development. I talked about the infrastructure supply. I was talking about the human capital supply. And the good thing about Nigeria is that we have a very young population. And so it simply means we have the opportunity, still have the opportunity to groom this young population into a very efficient labor force. But to do that, you have to look at the educational system. You have to start from the basic education. Today, about 19% of our school-age children are not being enrolled into schools. So you have to start from that point. And then you have to look at the curriculum of that educational system. Today, the world has moved to what they call STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. We have to adopt an educational curriculum that will equip our young people with the competencies we need to provide an efficient and effective labor force to the economy. Then when you have finished that, you now move to the building blocks. And that is the issue of policies. You look at your macroeconomic policy, the president made allusion to the stable macroeconomic policies. I know what works is that you can have a high inflation economy and expect to have a productive economy. So we must have a macroeconomic environment that, one, is that provides low cost of funds and stable exchange rate, as well as low inflation rate. Those elements are key for you to have, for people to plan, business people to plan. Then you now move to the next phase of it, which is the phase that has to do with selective stimulation of competitive sector of the economy where you have competitive advantage. Countries like China, countries like India have done that successfully. In fact, at some point, the immediate past Minister of Trade and Investment came up with special economic zones. If you look at the progress that China made, it was largely incubated at special economic zones, where government provides some of the most efficient infrastructure, provides some tax haven, and then leads to migration of the quality of labor they need to move to that location. And then creates some level of oasis of efficiency around those places. We wanted to do that, and it still looks like we've rested it. India has also done that successfully. So apart from having special economic zones where you have focused manufacturing activities, you also have to look at sectors of the economy or those products or services where we have competitive advantage. Today, Nigeria has proved, what they call a proof of concept in terms of cement manufacturing. We've moved from 2,000 metric tons of cement to more than 50 million metric tons, from 2 million metric tons to more than 50 million metric tons, because it was driven by policy. Economy is not driven by patriotic slogan. It is driven by policies that incentivize those who are into productive activities, so as to minimize their risk and optimize their return. That's what will drive people to invest. So we need to look at those sectors that we have, either we have the feedstock, and then we create incentives that will encourage people to go into those places. Such incentives to over time can actually be withdrawn when that industry has matured. We did that in the cement industry, and I said this is a proof of concept which we can replicate in several other industries where we have competitive advantage. In the cement industry, President Manuel came up with a cement industry plan and requested those who wanted to go into cement manufacturing to start setting up their manufacturing outfit, and then he would give them licenses to bring in bulk cement. And those who were not setting up manufacturing outfits could not get license for bulk cement. The bulk cement importation incentivized those people to make money, to build their factories. And there was a timeline that was defined for the cancellation or withdrawal of such bulk cement licenses. Thereafter, they were withdrawn. And today we have several people who are producing cement in the country. Remember, we always have limestone all the while since the creation of the world. But we had the limestone that was lying idle, and we entered into the same way we have the cement Amanda, where our Papa port was blocked by cement imports. So policies are critical in driving economic diversification. So, but you have to start from what will support the manufacturing or the economic engagement, which is the substructures I called, the quality of infrastructure, the quality of labor force.
Right.
You have the policy environment.
Sure.
Then you have to macroeconomic environment, cost of funds, inflation rate, exchange rate. These are factors we need to address to have stable economic and growth.
And talking about...
Well, before you intervene, Muda Yusuf, we're back to the presidential villa where the parade seems to have begun. That looks like the vice president there.
Dignitaries, you may please take your seats. Thank you.
Okay. That's the vice president.
Yes.
We know shout to
Your
seat.
Excellencies, most distinguished invited guest.
While we wait for the arrival of the president, in the meantime, we'll come back to the studio and focus more here on our conversation about the economy. Now, both of you gentlemen have talked about the pillars that would facilitate growth, infrastructure being one of them. And if we don't have the infrastructure, it's almost impossible to implement these ideas for a stabler Nigeria. Earlier last week, we know that the Minister of Finance, Zainab Ahmed, said that she believed that Nigeria would need $100 billion every year for the next 30 years to be able to bridge the infrastructure gap. The allocation for infrastructure from the budget is obviously far less than that. So if we aren't able to bridge that infrastructure gap, how can we achieve the Nigeria that we speak so fondly about?
Okay, that's also the issue of the policy that I mentioned earlier. The challenge we have today is that the Nigerian government does not have the revenue profile to build infrastructure. And unfortunately, the government has continued to insist on building infrastructure from budgetary allocation. If you look at the medium-term expenditure framework for 2020 to 2022, I think what they put is about 2.67 trillion naira for budgetary allocation to capital expenditure, which is about 23.8% of the entire 10 trillion budget. But the key thing is that what will 2 trillion or 3 trillion do for the country? You have mentioned, the figure you mentioned amounts about $3 trillion in 30 years. Our total revenue earnings will not be up to $3 trillion in 30 years. So my approach has been that the government should recognize that we don't have the capacity to generate the revenue for infrastructure build. So why don't we adopt alternative avenues or alternative methods to fund infrastructure? And those alternative avenue structures are good, available to us. Take, for instance, we have some commercially viable infrastructure corridor that we can give to private sector to build, manage, and transfer. Look at some of the arterial roads, the commercially viable roads. Lagos to Benin is commercially viable. Benin to Onitsha is commercially viable. Onitsha to Enugu and Onitsha to Owerri are commercially viable to Aba. Then Lagos to Ibadan. Ibadan through to Abuja. Abuja to Kanu, to Kaduna, Kanu. These are commercially viable corridors that the government can actually afford to bring in private capital to build. And the infrastructure will be there supporting productive activities in the country. The provider of infrastructure will earn their income, but it doesn't deny Nigeria the benefit of the use of the infrastructure. Then look at the road corridors. We only have one standard gauge rail that is functioning today. That's Abuja Kaduna standard gauge rail. There's no reason why we shouldn't have the Lagos standard gauge rail running today. There's no reason we shouldn't have similar infrastructure running to the southeast and south-south. And then northeast and northwest. But we don't have that because the government is waiting to make the money to build it. It's not possible. We're not going to ever get the money to build it. Give this to private sector operators to build.
The president seems to have addressed this issue in his speech this morning. Mm-hmm. And he did when he was referring to private sector partnership. and what you called road infrastructure tax credit scheme, to involve the private sector specifically in building roads. As for revenue, he talked about increasing revenues from oil and gas and promoting private investment in the oil and gas sector. And he says in this regard, he's going to make sure that he assigns to the petroleum industry bill and also the production sharing contract act, and then also, inland basin production sharing contracts. And he's hoping that government, will get more revenue from that. And third, he also said that within the next 3 months, he has asked the Ministry of Finance and Budget Planning to release up to about 600 billion for infrastructure development. But the question I want to ask both of you is that this looks like, promises,
okay.
like plans. Do you think that the government will follow through? Because in many instances in the past, we hear all these plans, we don't get results. And will this make any difference?
Okay, well, before you answer that question, Mr. Chukwu, we can go over to Abuja, where we see President Muhammadu Buhari has, in fact, arrived at the presidential palace for the Nigerian Independence Day parade.
Okay, we'll go back to the Independence Day parade as soon as possible. But before we went on break, I'd asked you about what you think of the measures outlined by the president to address infrastructure, capital expenditure particularly.
You see, the thing is that what the president said is fine about promoting public-private partnership. But these things require, you need to go beyond the rhetorics of it. I was listening to Johnson in another program where we talked about the experiences of investors in that space. There has to be confidence because we are talking about huge sums of money. And we're also talking about an investment that has a very long gestation period. We are talking of 20, 30 years for you to recoup your investments. And if you have an environment where you have seen people 2, 3 years into the contract, something goes wrong. People have to be going to arbitration, going to all sorts of things. You have, in fact, the best example we have is the Lagos-Ekpe Expressway. Very short distance anyway. Even with that, we had issues. We had the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway by Courtney. Something went wrong with that. We had this initiative with the Federal Secretariat. The Federal Secretariat is still lying there in litigation. Even the MM2, even though it's still standing, there are still a whole lot of issues around it. So respect for contractual obligations. Now, I was talking about this man who came with Virgin Nigeria. Yeah, he left with a very bitter experience. Because contracts were not respected. One government will come and say, okay, we are reviewing the contract and all sorts of things. So you need to create an environment that inspires confidence for us to be able to get this kind of long-term commitments to infrastructure. Perhaps the low-hanging fruit in all of this is perhaps the concessioning. The project is there, maybe you have finished constructing the road, rather than come back to be spending money to rehabilitate, to reconstruct. You can concession it so that the concessionaire will continue to maintain the road. You get some money from there, you move on to another road, you construct. So that way you minimize the risk of investment and you're able to attract more investors. Then we have to look at some of the long-term funds you have in the economy, like the pension funds, for instance. Is that a way we can plow that in a very safe way so that we don't jeopardize the pension of people into infrastructure investment. That will also help. But to rely on budgetary allocation, just as Johnson said, it's not sustainable. You don't even have the funds. You have a situation now where the current
what of the revenue streams that the president is talking about, from the oil and gas sector, from, other sources?
We have been talking about PIB for how many years now? For close to 15 years. These things require not just the rhetoric of it, the political will to make it happen. One of the most difficult areas to reform, given the political environment and political context here, is the oil and gas sector. We haven't moved. We haven't moved at all. And it's one of our major shortcomings, the biggest shortcoming in this economy. I mean, see what the UAE and the rest of them have done with oil money in terms of reinvesting, building infrastructure, making the economy sustainable. We have not moved. Even the bit of it that was passed has not been signed even by the president. So it requires very strong political will to take some tough decisions. And that is why when you are talking about the Economic Advisory Council, you can give the best of advice. And the truth is that we are not short of advice. If you go to our archives, you see fantastic recommendations that have been made on how to fix this economy. But who is looking at it? Who has the courage to pick it and implement? Because some of them can be politically also very costly. If you want to take some really tough decisions to turn around this economy. Are we ready for that? These are the kind of things that we need to do if we really want to fix this economy. It's one thing for the Economic Advisory Council to give advice. It's another thing for the advice to be taken. If you take the advice, another thing for the advice to be implemented.
Chukwu,
okay, let me wait a bit.
Yes.
You did mention that the president has said that he has given orders to release 600 billion naira. 600 billion naira is
3 months.
It's less than $2 billion. You did mention that we need $100 billion every year for 30 years. And we're talking about releasing barely $2 billion. That is just barely enough to fund the Lagos-Ibadan standard gauge rail that is now being extended to get to the seaports. The budget for the Lagos to extend the rail line to carry is more than $8 billion. And we're talking about releasing $2 billion. So in any case, the capacity of the government to generate revenue is highly not sufficient to meet the infrastructure need of the country. Ruben made a reference to the issue of improving crude production, oil production, because of the government is going to pass the petroleum industry bills. But what is our crude production capacity? What's our crude reserve?
Next is the center.
We have at best not done 1.9 million barrels per day. Even if you pass the petroleum industry bill and do the marginal feed auction, you will not you're not likely going to increase your production to more than 2.2 million barrels per day. And remember, the entire revenue is not coming to the federal government. So there is nothing that one can explain now until we expand the economy to the private sector that the government revenue can grow materially to fund infrastructure. And you can't expand the economy through the private sector if you do not build infrastructure that will support productive activities. Right. I have looked at what countries like China and India have done. Look at what countries like Malaysia. Some of these countries we used to consider as backwater economies. Today, they are tigers. So because you start from the basic, build the infrastructure, make sure your people have the competencies to work, and they have the skill sets that are required to work in the industries that your economy will accommodate. And then create an environment that people will have their property rights assured, people can go to court and get legal interpretation of contracts and enforcement, people can be safe in their neighborhood, their properties and their life will be safe. They are basic things that are not rocket science that the government should do. Safety or security, homeland security, issue of legal system. Today we have one of the most complex legal systems. You go to court on a commercial contract, it stays there for 20 years. By the time you get judgment, even if you get in your favor, the value of compensation is useless. And we're not doing anything about that. We are talking of P&ID, and the cases are being tried in British commercial courts. Our legal system was copied from the British system. Why are we not copying the commercial court system? Right. So that commercial cases are tried expeditiously because they involve time value of money. So we need to really, the key thing I must say here is that the focus should be on the private sector to grow the economy. And we need to provide the enabling environment for private sector to thrive. That will include the legal framework, the commercial framework, the infrastructural supply, the macroeconomic environment, and possibly some level of incentives that will make production to be efficient or relatively cost-effective.
Still on infrastructure, the president addressed the issue of the power sector, and he referred specifically to the agreement with the German government and Siemens to modernize the national grid in 3 phases. You know, and then generate like gigabytes, not megawatts this time, gigawatts, you know, in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. This looks like a long-term project, but do you think it's feasible? This is not the first time we have presidential power initiative, you know, presidential initiative on power, as they call it.
Do you know, Ruben, that the PNIED was as a result of presidential initiative directive on power supply? Are you aware of that? Yeah. Because it was under Yar'Adua's government that they gave a directive that Ministry of Power, Ministry of Petroleum should make available gas supply to the power plant, because at that point the allegations were that the problem with the power plant was because they were not getting gas supply. That the president gave a directive that they should make available gas supply to the power plant that led to the accelerated gas projects that put us into this PNID debacle. But back to what we are saying. The challenge with that directive is that, in the first place, the power sector had been fully deregulated other than the transmission grid. So if Siemens has to build a power plant, they have to build a power plant as a private sector operator. And they will have to source their gas supply to their power plant in case it's thermal power plant. Sure. And then they will feed their generation to the national transmission grid, who will now sell to the distribution companies. The core problem of the power sector is that the distribution companies, as a result of their failures, have led to the entire industrial value chain failing to achieve commercial viability. So if the distribution company, which are the retail end or the last mile distributor in the value chain, if they are unable to collect enough revenue to pay for power purchases, and then those who sell power to the distribution companies are unable to pay the generation companies, and the generation companies are unable to pay the gas supply companies, the entire value chain collapses. So we need to restrict that. So I don't know what Siemens will be able to do, other than if the power sector becomes commercially viable, they will set up a power plant or several power plants. Without the commercial viability of the power sector, anybody who is investing in that sector is going to go home with the tail short end of the stick. And that's the reality. So the first thing to do is that how do we intervene in the legal framework and the commercial framework of the power sector as to make it viable? The government has been giving handouts to the power sector. Sometimes they say they are giving them loans, sometimes they are giving them whatever they call it. That money is sinking down the drain until you make the distribution companies efficient and commercially viable. Then, before I forget, you made mention to the issue of infrastructure tax credit. I think I need to throw some clarification on that, because sometimes people get confused about the infrastructure tax credit. It is a good development, but it's not sufficient. It is far from sufficient. I will tell you why. The infrastructure tax credit is so that a business operator will build infrastructure, and the cost of that infrastructure will be recovered from tax credit. That tax liability is due from that operator. The core problem with infrastructure is capital intensive. So the time it will take you to recover, assuming your operation is profitable, will be donkey years, and no businessman will commit ₦1 trillion or 500 billion naira to infrastructure and hope that over the next 100 years his tax liabilities will be so high that he will be able to recoup it. Businesses invest for return. So that infrastructure tax credit is only applicable to short-end infrastructure that are local in nature, in the sense that you want to build a road to your factory. And because you don't expect the government will come and do it because of failings of the public service. So you say, okay, these 2 kilometers of road, I'll build it at 200 million, and then over the next 10 years, I'll recover it from my tax credit. But it's not that you go and build Lagos-Ibadan Expressway and expect
but from the speech, I was reading something about 700 and something kilometers of road that has been covered under the tax credit. That is quite high.
I can tell you that it's not economically feasible for anybody to build a major arterial road and expect to recover it from tax credit from your commercial operations.
And on the power thing, I think we need to look also a lot more at decentralization. Because the current model where you load everything into the national grid, the transmission lines and all of that, first is very expensive. Yeah. And sometimes it doesn't look as if it's something that can actually solve the kind of problem that we have very quickly. So we should be looking at these mini grids, so that you have isolated stations, people building small power stations to feed particular communities and so on. And also the renewable energy component. We need to bring down the cost of renewable. We need to crash the tariffs and taxes on solar panels, on solar batteries, on inverters, so that people, individuals, even in their small homes, in their individual homes, can find these things more affordable and just move on with their lives. Rather than waiting for all these long cables that are traveling several kilometers to deliver power.
Well, one of the things the president said, with regard to the economy, is that we must also be prepared to learn lessons from the past by managing our oil revenue far more prudently and by also ensuring that we focus, on the non-oil job-creating sector of the economy. But let's take some time to look at the presidential change of guards at the presidential villa to mark the 59th independence anniversary of Nigeria.
Your Excellency, Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, inspection over. Shortly will be the inspection of the weapons of the quarter guard in preparation for their duties by the officer commanding.
Well, that's still the presidential change of guards to mark the 59th Independence Day anniversary of Nigeria. Well, gentlemen, you've helped us a lot, you've done a lot, but before you go, let me just point out that there were other key issues raised by the president: fighting corruption and restoring good governance. And he also talked at length about security. But we may not have enough time to focus on all of that. But if I may ask you, when we were much younger, the Independence Day anniversary used to be far more elaborate than this, with parades, school children, having a march past and all of that. Do you prefer the old style or you prefer this new style, which is cheaper and far more modest, in my view?
I think the old style is better because it creates a lot of excitement, especially among school children. I remember as a primary school pupil at that time. It's something that we always look forward to. In fact, we dance to the music of the military and all of that.
And you, Chukwu,
so
this new modest, cheaper style or the old elaborate march past in various stadiums across the country?
I think what we're seeing now is a mark of the bad times we are witnessing as a country. As a young boy, I grew up with a lot of optimism about the future and prospects of this country. I'm not sure people of that age now have the same level of optimism about the country. We've seen a series of failures or failings of the society to meet the expectations of the citizens. And over time, people are losing the excitement associated with the National Day. Probably by the time we rebuild the country and we rebuild the opportunities that are available to the citizens, people are more excited and want to see more elaborate celebration. We moved from Ego Square and we now retracted into the State House. We are running from insecurity. We are also dealing with the fact that not too many people are so enthusiastic about going out there. Let me tell you, Ruben, when I was a child, we had a song we were singing. We came from the Civil War. I was born during the Civil War. And we, as a literature, we use Nigeria as it's a promised land. Africa is a dear continent. We are marching on to take our place among other nations of the world.
Certainly.
And I'm not sure the young people now will sing the same song.
Anyway, thank you very much, Johnson Chukwu, and thank you very much, Muda Yusuf.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So once again, happy Independence Day.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You can see the way we address all of it.
Yes, I see you are in the mood.